Hello everyone and welcome to Kernel of Wisdom. I'm Joelle and today I'm explaining what it means to have anxiety. Before I get started, just a reminder, if you like this video, please help others find it by clicking the like button below or subscribe for more information from Kernel of Wisdom. As a counselor, psychotherapist, and mindfulness coach, anxiety and anxiety-related disorders are some of the most common issues that I see with patients and clients. But what is anxiety exactly? How is it different from the fear or worry that we all experience on a semi-regular basis? Anxiety can be defined as the central nervous system's physiological and emotional response to a vague sense of threat or danger. Now, compare this with the definition of fear that follows. Fear is the central nervous system's physiological and emotional response to a serious threat to one's well-being. Did you catch the difference there? Both are automatic physiological and emotional reactions, which suggests that we don't really have a lot of control over either anxiety or fear. But they are stimulated by slightly different triggers or perceptions of the threat itself. Fear occurs when we're aroused by an actual, definite threat. It tends to be more intense, but also more short-lived. Anxiety is when we experience a vague sense of threat. In other words, there's no definite threat that we could put our finger on, so to speak. You just feel distressed, uncertain, and alerted to the possibility of a looming threat. So it's perception that's driving this. And anxiety also tends to be slightly less intense than an acute fear, but longer lasting. But what I want to make clear is that the person experiencing anxiety really fully and deeply feels that there is an actual threat. They aren't seeing it as something that's possibly unnecessary. They are worrying because they really feel this is something significant and important to worry about. The threat feels just as real as if a bear were chasing them down, which is why our evolutionary mechanism for dealing with these types of threats kicks in. Let me talk a little bit about that evolutionary mechanism. It's often called the fight, flight, or freeze response. And essentially what's happening is that our body's physiology is preparing us to deal with a potential threat in one of these three ways. So one, it might prepare you to fight back, especially if it seems like there's little chance you could flee, because that's often evolution's safest way of protecting you. And it occurs if you think you can win. The second option it prepares you for is flight, to run away, to flee. This happens if it seems like there's a reasonable possibility of getting away from the threat, and if it doesn't seem like you could probably fight back. But then the last response is to freeze. Evolutionarily speaking, the freeze response gives predators the impression that you're already dead and potentially ill, which means they might not want to eat your meat. So it tends to be a bit of a last resort response, especially if it doesn't seem like you're in a situation you can just escape or get away from, or if you don't think you're likely to win if you were to fight back. And all of this happens instantly, automatically. It's instinctual. You're not consciously thinking about this. And the problem is that today we're rarely chased down by bears or actual predators. But whether a threat is real or perceived, our automatic response is the same. Let's use an example to help illustrate this. Let's say you're home alone at night and it's dark. And maybe you've even just finished watching a scary movie, which means fearful thoughts are already primed in your mind. Then you hear a loud noise downstairs. You feel afraid. You feel that fear response rush up. It kicks you into fight, flight, or freeze. The brain starts to assess. You're not really sure what the threat is yet. Your instincts cause you to think a lot about the threat, to really scan and assess what's going on. You consider possibilities. What caused that noise? You don't have a cat. It was loud. It sounded like something really big. More and more, you notice your body's listening. It's alert. It's focusing on the noise. It's trying to figure out what's going on. You're listening so hard, you actually feel like you can hear more creaking, subtle sounds of something moving downstairs. So you consider your options. Maybe you can hide, which is a form of fleeing, but you're not sure. You don't really have great hiding spots that you can think of. So you freeze. You're paralyzed with fear. As you freeze, your mind continues to race, to scan the environment with your ears, with your eyes, with whatever you can sense to assess what's going on. Your palms get sweaty. Sweat's trying to cool your body so that it slows down, so that it can stay very still. Your breath becomes shallow, barely perceptible. As a result, your heart starts to race, still keeping a heart rate up so that if you need to flee, so that if you need to fight, you're ready. You feel tension and tingling all over. Your muscles go stiff, again accentuating this freeze response, making you look dead, immobile. And all you can do is just listen and wait. And your whole body is fighting to keep it that way. After some time, nothing happens. Your freeze response starts to ease up, but you're still afraid. You're still somewhat ready to fight, flee, or freeze again. But since nothing's happened yet, you somehow start to work up the courage to peek downstairs to see what might have happened. And then you see that you left the window open and the breeze must have knocked your coat rack over. With this realization, this pull back into reality, you realize there's nothing really to fear. Your physiological responses stay heightened for a little bit, but it starts to slowly relax, slowly come down. You might even laugh at yourself, realizing how afraid you were of the wind. This describes a typical fear response. Notice that it was intense and short-lived. Also notice that because it was based in reality, you were able to look and see what actually happened, which removed the fear. Now, one of the troubles with anxiety, and more specifically with the things that cause anxiety, is that they're not so easy to just look at and see that they're not real. How do you discredit the threat of social rejection, of someone criticizing or humiliating you? Or how do you know with absolute 100% certainty, even if it's unlikely, that the plane you're on won't crash? Or how do you know you won't get sick unless you do everything in your power to prevent it? Or how do you deal with the threat, the reality that life is unpredictable, uncontrollable, and uncertain, especially if you feel relatively helpless or if uncertain circumstances have produced negative outcomes for you in the past? With anxiety, there's not necessarily, oh, it's just the wind type moments. And so for those suffering from anxiety, it's so normal and so natural to feel stuck in your feelings of fear, in that fight, flight, or freeze response. And you may be asking yourself, well, why do some people get stuck in these feelings and other people don't? Research suggests there's probably a number of reasons. Biologically, there's the possibility that some people may have evolved to be more fearful. If you think about it, those that were more anxious, those that were more alert to fears, to possible threats in their environment, were more cautious and therefore more likely to survive. And so those genes would have been passed down. And there are signs that anxiety is heritable, that it's passed down through our genes. In addition, there's evidence to also suggest that anxiety may be represented in abnormalities in the brain or neurochemicals that are just off balance. Psychologically, recall that anxiety comes down to what we perceive as a threat. So people with anxiety tend to think differently about their environment, other people, and the world around them, or even themselves. For one, they may have more misinformation about threats and the likelihood of negative outcomes or negative events happening. Second, they may have thoughts about themselves as being less capable of dealing with threat, as being somewhat helpless, or being someone who's incapable of dealing effectively with their emotions, including a strong emotion like fear. It's not uncommon for people to become anxious about their anxiety, and this is often because they don't think that they can handle anxiety. It becomes a threat in and of itself. In addition, for anybody, there's a natural response that happens in our minds when we become fearful or anxious. It's called threat-related attentional bias. As we saw in the example I gave earlier, what happens when we perceive or find an actual threat in our environment is that we become very attentive to it. We have to pay absolute attention to it in order to assess whether the threat is real or not, if it's coming at us or not, and to choose the appropriate fight, flight, or freeze response. And so our brain turns all of its energy into focusing on the threat and turns off some of its ability to focus on other things, which makes it very difficult for someone with anxiety to shift their thinking to something else or to even concentrate on other tasks when they're anxious. In terms of behavioral triggers, one of the biggest challenges for someone who's dealing with anxiety is that you have a strong urge to avoid, to, at a subtle level, flee what makes you anxious. And the trouble with that is, if you avoid what makes you anxious, you never get the opportunity to learn how to deal with it or that you can handle it. Again, go back to the noise in the house example I gave earlier. The way that we were able to alleviate our fear, our anxiety, was that we were able to look down and see that the threat wasn't real, that it was just the coat rack. If you avoid what makes you anxious, if you avoid looking down to see what happened, you're never going to get the opportunity to see that everything's okay. And again, that avoidance, that feeling that I can't look at the fear directly, reinforces a sense of helplessness, a feeling that you can't handle anxiety, that your only option is to avoid. In terms of emotional triggers, people with anxiety in general have trouble dealing with difficult emotions, and they may have trouble dealing with discomfort or uncertainty, not knowing what is going to happen. These feelings just feel like too much for them, and usually that's because they just didn't have the opportunity to learn different or more effective coping skills or emotion regulation skills. And then there are also some environmental and social contributing factors to anxiety as well. It is not uncommon for those with anxiety to have dealt with some difficult life circumstances in the past. They may have more acute trauma or developmental trauma in their histories, or they may have just been exposed to early life circumstances that taught them that the world and other people are scary, unpredictable things. Taught them to look at the world as a threat, to always be vigilant for the possibility of things going wrong, because this has happened so often in their past, and it's often led to negative outcomes or circumstances for them. Or in childhood, they could have simply learned coping styles or emotional regulation styles that aren't always effective in the face of uncertainty or fear. And in either circumstance, whether uncertainty was something that was very threatening for them as children in reality, or whether uncertainty is something that they just don't know how to tolerate very well, or both, the reality is we live in an uncertain, unpredictable world. So if you don't feel prepared to be able to deal with that, it's really common to feel very anxious. And that anxiety may be related to specific circumstances based on that history, or general circumstances based on that history. Okay, well, I've tried to summarize, but there is a lot of research out there on anxiety, its causes, and what to do about it. So this certainly doesn't cover every reason someone might be anxious, but I hope it gives a bit of an overview. I also hope this video has helped to explain what anxiety is and why it happens, or a little bit about what it might be like to have anxiety. I also want to note that there are many forms of anxiety, from phobias to generalized anxiety disorder to panic disorder to anxiety-related disorders like obsessive-compulsive disorder. Each of these disorders has its own unique features, and I do plan to do more videos speaking about anxiety, its different forms, and what you can do to feel better when you're anxious, in addition to some of the mindful resources I have here. But I'll leave that for now to future videos. In the meantime, if you are suffering from anxiety, or someone you know and love is suffering from anxiety, please look in the description below for some resources that can help, including my contact information, so that I can connect you with someone who can help you most effectively where you are. If you have any comments or questions about this subject, please feel free to post in the comment box below. Finally, if you liked this video, or if you want to show support for the subject, please click the like button below or subscribe for more information from Kernel of Wisdom. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day and be well. Bye.